voices told him to do it.
Amityville, a quaint village on the south shore of Long Island, about an hour's drive from the hustle and bustle of New York City. A seemingly ordinary American town whose name is derived from the Latin word for friend. Yet it is also a name that remains inextricably linked to a series of events that began with the brutal murder of an entire family and ended with another family's nightmare. The story became known to the world as the Amityville Horror, but it's a story that the people of this closed-door community would just as soon forget.
All that publicity and the movies I thought were ridiculous too, and I just didn't believe it. I guess I don't believe the supernatural.
It's the drunk kids that come back looking for a thrill night. They have nothing to do, so let's go to Amityville and find the house.
Long before gaining notoriety for its house of horrors, Amityville was a community rich in history.
Will Rogers lived here. Annie Oakley was here. Goddard, the great space flight engineer, shot off the first rocket here. Even George Washington spent a day here supping, as he said in his diary, as he completed his tour of Long Island.
But for nearly 3 decades, a certain house on Ocean Avenue has attracted more attention than any other landmark and cast an ominous shadow over this otherwise idyllic coastal village. This modern-day horror story has its origins in the history of Amityville and Ocean Avenue itself, a history that dates back to the region's earliest settlers, the Montaukett Indians. According to legend, the Indians once believed the land now known as Ocean Avenue to be a power spot, perhaps even an area infested by demons. Tribal enemies, or those said to be possessed by evil spirits, were left to die on this land and then buried face down, cursed to stare for all eternity into the dark abode their spirit was sent to join.
Montaukets believe there is good and there is evil. The spirit is very movable and it can come and go and do a lot of things.
Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror documents another legend about the Ocean Avenue property, one dating back to the Salem witch trials of the late 1600s. According to this account, a man named John Ketchum, after being forced out of Massachusetts for practicing witchcraft, set up residence on or near the spot of Amityville's famed House of Horrors. It is said that Ketchum continued his alleged devil worship until his death, and that his body may be buried somewhere on the property. Early deeds do suggest that Ketchum may have existed, but whether he fled from Salem or ever practiced witchcraft on the land cannot be verified.
We were never able to physically connect the Ketchums who were burned at the stake in Salem, Massachusetts. But it's very interesting that there's a Ketchum Street or a Ketchum Place right in the immediate vicinity of the residence.
In the summer of 1965, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue is sold to the DeFeos, a close-knit Italian Catholic family. It is a prosperous time for the city-bred DeFeos, a prosperity evidenced by their move from a small Brooklyn apartment to the 6-bedroom, 2.5-story Dutch colonial on Long Island's affluent South Shore. The DeFeos have 5 children: John Matthew, Mark, Allison, Dawn, and their eldest son, Ronald Jr., better known as Ronnie or Butch.
Ronnie had a close relationship with his mother. His relationship with his father was a love-hate relationship.
Mr. DeFeo's way of showing love to his children, especially his eldest son Ronnie, is by spoiling them with money and material things.
It would be nothing for his father to give him, $1,000 for him to spend. He never really had to work. He had a lot of jobs that he lost. He wound up working in a car agency for the father, but he didn't have to. I think they thought that money would make the difference. Look how wonderful our life is. But it's not very wonderful.
Material excesses and family discord may not have been the only forces at work in the DeFeo home. From the very beginning, Ronald DeFeo Jr. senses that he is not alone in the house.
Well, when I first moved in, you start hearing noises of different things at night. Noise, like you thought somebody might have been walking around, pipes banging. Oh, they were always screaming. Somebody's in the house, ghost, or once in a while you'd hear screaming, but there wasn't nobody screaming.
According to trial testimony, by 1973, the incidents of violence and abuse within the family begin to escalate.
Ronnie's mother was downstairs doing laundry, but the kids were making a tremendous fuss. And she was yelling at the kids were yelling, and the father kept yelling at her to shut up. He wanted to eat his meal in peace. And she comes up the stairs with a basket of laundry, and the father walks over to the stairs and punches her in the face. She falls down the stairs. He closes the door and he says, "Now we'll have some peace. We can eat in peace." And that scene, for me, summed up what life must have been like in that house.
Desperate to escape his troubled home life, Ronnie immerses himself in Long Island's South Shore bar scene and the early 1970s drug subculture.
He was into heroin. He was big into speed. He would take LSD. So I think he was a very heavy user, and he probably started very early.
As Ronnie spirals out of control, one family argument nearly turns lethal.
All sorts of violence is going on. Ronnie's sister Dawn and her father are having a violent argument. And so Ronnie's going to settle the argument.
Picked up a shotgun. I knew the gun was loaded, And I said, "That's the hell, I want to kill him." Hey! The gun didn't go off.
And it turns out there are bullets in the chamber, but nothing happened. So the father felt that was the wonderful miracle. His son didn't kill him.
In a show of devotion, Mr. DeFeo surrounds the house with religious statuary. But is it divine intervention or something more sinister which impels the family to seek help from the Catholic Church?
As they felt the devil was in the house. That's what brought all that religion into the house.
Mr. DeFeo went to St. Joseph's Shrine 6 months before he was murdered to bring back a priest who would say the prayers of exorcism in his home. And from all the information I learned, candles were toppling over, doors were opening and closing.
A letter from St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, Canada, states that they have no official record of this incident.
When people asked Mr. DeFeo why he had all these special holy statues around his home, he said, "It's because I have a devil on my back."
But was Mr. DeFeo referring to the devil incarnate or to his deeply troubled son?
Maybe it was fear. Maybe it's that, is it possible that down deep they all loved each other? Or that it's something he didn't want to face, that his son could be capable of murder?
Whatever the source of their fear, the DeFeos seem to have an uncanny awareness of the terrible fate soon to befall them.
Lynn Anowitz, the housekeeper to the DeFeo family, stated to me on several occasions during the trial that Mrs. DeFeo told her that there was going to be a terrible tragedy occurring to her family.
Desperate to escape his tumultuous home life, Ronnie moves out of the house on several occasions.
The problem was that Mr. DeFeo used all his resources, all his connections, to go out searching for his son each time and dragged him back to the home. This was just helping the volcano become more violent within Ronnie.
By the early days of November 1974, tensions in the household reach a breaking point.
Just days before the murders, he and his father had an argument where his father referred to him as a devil. It came close to blows. Ronnie stormed out. And you know, to say, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to kill all of you. And he did.
November 13th, 1974. While his family sleeps, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. sits in a darkened room watching television.
The television program he was watching was an army movie called Castle Keep. And in this picture, The last 15 to 20 minutes is complete destruction of the American and German troops. Ronnie said that during this movie, he heard his family members whispering, and he thought or believed that they were conspiring to kill him. At or about the end of the movie, he said that a person with black hands appeared and gave him the rifle. And he went ahead and he proceeded to shoot each member of his family.
No, he shot my father first, then crossed over once my mother died first. After that, I tell you honestly, I couldn't stop if I wanted to. I couldn't put the gun down. So I felt somebody was inside moving me.
He went into another room and shot his two younger brothers. Then he went in and shot his younger sister. And then he went upstairs and shot his older sister, Dawn.
When it is over, 6 members of the DeFeo family, Ronald Sr., his wife Louise, daughters Dawn, 18, and Allison, 13, and sons Mark, 11, and John Matthew, 9, lie slaughtered in their beds. The following evening, Ronnie himself reports the murders. Citing his family's alleged mafia connections, Ronnie is taken into protective custody. Within hours, however, he confesses. News of the tragedy spreads quickly, leaving friends, family, and the entire community devastated.
There was enormous shock. I think it's still one of the things for which Long Island remains infamous.
At DeFeo's trial 1 year later, defense attorney William Weber tries to prove that his client was legally insane at the time he committed the murders and therefore not responsible for his actions. Ultimately, the jury finds him sane and guilty on all 6 counts of second-degree murder.
He said voices told him to do it.
All they asked me is, what happened in that house that night? I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. There was a fight earlier that night. My father told my sister, I'm going to get you, I'm going to get you. Now the 2 of you. It's not one of you anymore, it's both of you. We both agreed he had to go. So we waited for him to go to sleep. But we both walked in the room and we closed the door. Them doors are 2 inches thick and they're solid oak. I looked at my sister. I didn't have the heart to do it. I had to pump some courage up in me. I had a lot of dope in me too. And I swear to God, I had the gun pointed at him. He must have heard us or something. He must have opened his eyes. He was on his stomach. He must have opened his eyes and seen the 2 of us in the mirror. And man, he started to get up. I had the gun pointed and just going through my mind now, boy, if he gets his hands on this gun, he's going to wrap it around my neck. Next thing you know, I hear a shot. But I didn't fire it. He's getting up. He's starting to get up now, my father. I put a second round in him. It was mass confusion. So I swing the gun over and fire another shot. Now I shot my mother. I didn't know what the hell was going on. I said, well, you know, I mean, this is crazy. This is mass confusion in this bedroom. Mass confusion.
Yet even as Ronald DeFeo Jr. serves 6 consecutive 25-year-to-life prison terms, several troubling mysteries about the murders remain.
To this day, no one is certain how Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his parents, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters, and nobody heard a thing, how none of them even woke up. Maybe they were drugged. No, that proved not to be true.
The next theory was that, well, he had a silencer on it. That theory didn't hold water. There would be some fragments of the silencer that would have been left on the crime scene.
How did 6 people get killed and there are no gunshots?
One possible explanation is offered by parapsychologist Hans Holzer.
When there is a strong psychic field, sound will be inhibited. We know this from other cases because the electromagnetic field, which is representative of an entity of this kind, does interfere with the perception of sound, and sound was not heard.
Others believe that the position of the 6 bodies bears an eerie similarity to the local Indian legend, which holds that tribal enemies were buried face down. An Indian curse, some say, may have driven Ronald DeFeo Jr. to murder.
Young DeFeo had always been very high-strung and certainly given to psychic ability. And it is not inconceivable that the influence in the house were manifested gradually through him. I think the entity tried to get them out of the house because the house was on sacred ground.
After Ronald DeFeo's trial and conviction, the people of Amityville believed the horror was over. It had just begun. In the summer of 1975, newlyweds George and Kathleen Lutz begin house hunting on Long Island. George, a 28-year-old ex-Marine, runs his family's surveying firm. Kathy, 30, has 3 children from a previous marriage: Daniel, 10, Christopher, 7, and Melissa, 5. Although the Lutzes have only a modest budget, the real estate broker talks them into viewing a certain Dutch colonial overlooking the water on upscale Ocean Avenue.
It's the kind of house they don't build anymore. A relic of a time when the world wasn't in such a hurry, when there was still time for a little charm and elegance. It has stood empty for a long while, and at the price, it is a bargain. For a growing young family, it is almost too good to be true.
What do you think? I love it.
This is the first interview the Lutzes have granted in more than 20 years.
We first saw the house in the fall of 1975. Went over with the broker. She said, I wanted to show you what the other half of Amityville lived like.
Pulling up to it, she started to tell us things that the house had as far as the number of bedrooms.
When we walked in the house, Kathy looked around right from the foyer and just started smiling. She really fell in love with the house. It was very obvious. And we walked through. It had 6 bedrooms and a boathouse for our boat and 2-car garage and a heated pool and a basement on the water, which was very rare.
All the things that we talked about, we found in one place. For George and myself, we could bring more things together within this marriage. A new home, space for everybody, space for growth.
Only after George, Kathy, and the children fall in love with the house does the broker mention its gruesome past.
And she explained to us about the DeFeo massacre and wanted to know if that would change our view on the house at all.
We discussed it among the 5 of us, and there was no problem. It was, it was unfortunate that that had happened there. It was reflected in the price, of course, but we weren't superstitious, thinking that there was anything wrong that way.
There was a sign outside the front of the house when we first looked at it. It said High Hopes. And when I look now, those same high hopes were within us.
On December 18th, 1975, 13 months after the murders, George and Kathy move in with their 3 children and the family dog, Harry. A friend of George's, after learning of the house's tragic history, insists that he get it blessed by a Catholic priest. Lutz, a Methodist, calls upon the only priest he knows, Father Ralph Pecoraro.
I first met Father Ralph, which we came to know him as Father Ray, when I was in the process of obtaining an annulment from my first marriage. He and I became good friends.
On the same day the Lutzes are moving in, Father Ray comes to bless the house.
I was blessing the sewing room. It was cold. It was really cold in there. And I thought, gee, this is peculiar, because it was a lovely day out. It was winter, yes, but it didn't account for that kind of coldness.
It wasn't until much later that we learned what it was that had happened to him while he was doing that. He did stop us before leaving and say to us that not to spend too much time in that sewing room. For some reason, he felt uncomfortable there.
I was sprinkling holy water, and I heard a rather deep voice behind me saying, "Get out." It seemed so directed toward me. I was really quite startled. I felt a slap at one point on the face. I felt somebody slap me, and there was nobody there.
Christmas, 1975. For the Lutz family, the lovely house at 112 Ocean Avenue is a dream come true. But from the day they move in, they begin to detect the house's strange sensations.
All homes have sounds that you need to come adjusted to. How the water sounds, the dishwasher in the middle of the night. There's sounds that all homes have.
As the holidays draw to a close, however, the sensations in the house grow increasingly ominous.
After the love of Christmas came down, that's when the sounds in the house were different. They weren't ones that I wanted to become familiar with. They changed. There wasn't the warm glow anymore. Now there was a blaze. There was a scraping. And there was a banging. The children who had been anticipating a holiday were now anticipating different things that brought a fear onto their face.
We each saw things so drastically different than the person right next to us that it was very hard for us to communicate even as a family.
When I look back sometimes, I describe it like a three-ring circus, each one being in their own room or their own area of the house, experiencing for themselves something different than what the other person was.
George is attacked by a sensation of intense cold. He compulsively builds fires in the living room fireplace, but he can never get warm enough.
He became obsessed with how much firewood there was, and then would there be enough to keep burning, that he would be continually going about the fireplace, checking the fire.
Fights break out between the normally loving family members. Slowly, each of their personalities begins to change. In the ensuing days, the family is subjected to a series of strange and inexplicable events. Extreme fluctuations in temperature, recurring black stains on the bathroom fixtures, and an infestation of flies in the dead of winter.
When we first looked at the house, very first time, we noticed no flies anywhere in the house. Especially when you think back now, they were limited, in particular, to the sewing room second floor. Same bedroom that Father Ray had asked us not to use as a bedroom. The longer we were in the house, the more flies there were in that room. I don't have an explanation for how or why, but that's where they were.
As the days wear on, other strange discoveries fuel the Lutz's mounting sense of unease.
I was down in the basement one afternoon, and there was a particular shelving area that I really wanted to relocate, and it looked like a portable. So I moved it, and much to my surprise, there was a small room behind it, and it was painted a red.
We keep calling it a room, but we don't know what else to call it. It was a very small space. The fact that it was red and that it had an odor was the disturbing part. Then when Harry, our black lab, wouldn't go near the room, cowered away from it, that was more disturbing.
This red room was not in the original house plans. Who built it? Why was it hidden? Soon the Lutz's puzzlement turns to abject terror. Night after night, George is snapped awake at 3:15 a.m., the established time of the murders. While Kathy is plagued by nightmares in which she relives the horror of the DeFeo tragedy.
There was one that was very vivid, and where I experienced where the bullets went in and out of Mrs. DeFeo's body, and I was able to determine who died in what order. And later on, when we met with William Weber, who was the attorney for Ronald DeFeo, and he confirmed what the police had found, and they had never published where the bullets went in and out of the body.
George becomes disturbed at the way his wife and children begin sleeping in their beds, the same position as the murdered DeFeos.
I would not sleep on my stomach, everyone else did. None of us ever slept on our stomachs before moving in the house. We later came to believe that's the position the bodies were in.
Slowly but inexorably, the influence spreads to the children, in particular, 5-year-old Missy, who boasts about her new imaginary playmate, Jody.
I recall one morning I was in the kitchen, and Melissa came in, and she said to me, "Mommy, do angels talk?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." "Why?" And she said, "Well, I think I have an angel in my room."
Missy described it as a pig that had the ability to be very big or very small, invisible or visible. But Missy would say things about it that it said that you knew she couldn't make up on her own. One of the most uncomfortable statements that Jody made was, "You will always live here." That's not something that makes you comfortable to hear your child invisible friend is saying.
George and Kathy dismiss the stories of their daughter's invisible friend until Jody makes its presence known to them.
I saw eyes looking down at me from Missy's bedroom window when I would be coming back from the boathouse at night. I would run into the house, run upstairs, and there'd be nothing there. There would be times that Missy would be sitting on her bed talking, and you'd walk past, you'd see the rocking chair moving, but Missy was on the bed. There were a couple of times that we saw eyes from the outside looking into the house. There were tracks in the snow that were made by something with a cloven hoof.
During the first 2 weeks of January 1976, a series of terrifying and mind-numbing events finally convinced the Lutzes that some evil force is residing in their house.
How do you explain an odor that all of a sudden appears, or a cold spot in a room that you walk through, the cold is not there anymore? Or the front door slamming, and you go running down and the door's still locked, but you heard it happen.
Desperate to rid their home of the diabolical presence, the Lutzes are advised by a friend to first open all of the windows throughout the house and then go from room to room reciting the Lord's Prayer.
Sounded like a solution to us. We did the same thing. When we did that, we heard a chorus of voices say to us, "Will you stop?" I believe that's one of the things that we did that caused the presence there to become less than happy with us.
Not until sunrise does the family dare fall asleep, unaware that their battle with the supernatural has just begun. After failing to cast the evil presence out of the house on Ocean Avenue, the Lutzes attempt to seek help from Father Ray, the Catholic priest who first came to bless the house, but find their efforts to reach him thwarted by some unknown force.
Any time I would attempt that call, that contact, he would run into interference on the phone. There were times when Father Ray would attempt to call us, and the connection again would be broken up with static.
After we left the house, Father Ray told the story of sitting in the Chancellor's office and just discussing the possibility of helping us in some way, and hearing the heat come up in the pipes, in the radiators, and the incredible chill, cold that came into the room. And he said all we were doing was discussing it when this started happening.
After again attempting to bless the house on their own, the Lutzes experience a night of horror they say they will never forget. The last night they would ever spend in the house. Never do the Lutzes discuss the specific events of that night. The memory, they say, is still too disturbing.
We left the house because the house became uninhabitable. As far as we were concerned, there was no reason to stay there anymore. There were too many things happening too often and confronting us constantly. Those specific events are not something that we try to sit down and explain to anyone else. That's why the book was done, so that that's not something that we have to go through anymore.
To describe fear and the depth of what fear can do within you is hard to verbalize. To describe evil, which has no boundary, is hard to present. But this is what the family was experiencing that night. Each one, with the degree that they could handle, this sense for our very lives was there, and we chose to go.
On January 14, 1976, 28 days after moving in, the Lutzes flee 112 Ocean Avenue, abandoning the house and everything they own. Despite the certainty of a huge financial loss, George and Kathy decide to return the house to the bank and sell all of their personal belongings at auction.
We couldn't eradicate that which was there and didn't want to be responsible for passing it on.
We bought the house for $80,000. It had a mortgage of $60,000. We had put another 4,000 or so down at the closing. When the auctioneer took care of the contents of the house, I think we netted $1,600, something like that, from the sale. We moved to California and we started over.
One of the instructions we received was that there was one item that we could take out, but anything else would not have been healthy for us. The one item that we had was a large cedar box that had been built by George's grandfather, and inside of that were some of the children's baby pictures. That's about the only item we came out with.
Although the Lutzes may have escaped Amityville, they cannot escape the onslaught of publicity that follows them to California.
When we left the house, we sat down and did a series of tapes for self-help, and we just talked about everything we could possibly remember that took place in the house. And that eventually became the Amityville Horror, the book. The movie, on the other hand, was a work of Hollywood.
In the midst of all the media hype surrounding their story, the Lutzes claim the evil forces continued to haunt them for many years, until help came from the exorcist for the Archbishop of Canterbury.
He performed a rite in his church that helped us for the rest of our lives. There came a point when we said we have to stop blaming things that aren't right or going right in our lives on the house. But as time went on, it was like a half-life. It just slowly went away until today it really doesn't exist.
George and Kathy, who are now divorced, maintain that their experiences in Amityville have had the most lasting impact on their personal lives.
This story of our lives through Amityville is not the story of one person going through. It's the story of a family, 5 members, each one coming with what affected them and bringing it in. I think what we lost there was the people that we had been prior to moving in. The children in particular, their life was so dramatically touched by what they experienced there. So you could retrieve some things, but you couldn't retrieve that portion of your life prior to.
But what of the supernatural forces that drove the family out of 112 Ocean Avenue? What exactly were they? And why did they seem to only affect the Lutzes?
When we moved into the house, we were practicing transcendental meditation. I think in the practice of that, it opened up the mind and the spirit to other things and brought about a sharpened sensitivity. And I think we opened ourselves up to it.
I think that whatever was there was very intelligent, very impatient. I think its abilities are far more powerful than we really understand. I think you know evil from experiencing it.
I would say it was demonic.
He said voices told him to do it.
It took a dream and it shattered it. It took innocence and it destroyed it. And it was out for life itself.
What the fuck? What the fuck?
People in my house.
He said voices told him to do it.
What? What the fuck?
Amityville, a quaint village on the south shore of Long Island, about an hour's drive from the hustle and bustle of New York City. A seemingly ordinary American town whose name is derived from the Latin word for friend. Yet it is also a name that remains inextricably linked to a series of events that began with the brutal murder of an entire family and ended with another family's nightmare. The story became known to the world as the Amityville Horror, but it's a story that the people of this closed-door community would just as soon forget.
All that publicity and the movies I thought were ridiculous too. I just didn't believe it. I guess I don't believe the supernatural.
It's the drunk kids that come back looking for a thrill night. They have nothing to do. So let's go to Amityville and find the house.
Long before gaining notoriety for its house of horrors, Amityville was a community rich in history.
Will Rogers lived here. Annie Oakley was here. Goddard, the great space flight engineer, shot off the first rocket here. Even George Washington spent a day here supping, as he said in his diary, as he completed his tour of Long Island.
But for nearly 3 decades, a certain house on Ocean Avenue has attracted more attention than any other landmark and cast an ominous shadow over this otherwise idyllic coastal village. This modern-day horror story has its origins in the history of Amityville and Ocean Avenue itself, a history that dates back to the region's earliest settlers, the Montaukett Indians. According to legend, the Indians once believed the land now known as Ocean Avenue to be a power spot, perhaps even an area infested by demons. Tribal enemies, or those said to be possessed by evil spirits, were left to die on this land and then buried face down, cursed to stare for all eternity into the dark abode their spirit was sent to join.
Montaukets believe there is good and there is evil. The spirit is very movable and it can come and go and do a lot of things.
Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror documents another legend about the Ocean Avenue property, one dating back to the Salem witch trials of the late 1600s. According to this account, a man named John Ketchum, after being forced out of Massachusetts for practicing witchcraft, set up residence on or near the spot of Amityville's famed House of Horrors. It is said that Ketchum continued his alleged devil worship until his death, and that his body may be buried somewhere on the property. Early deeds do suggest that Ketchum may have existed, but whether he fled from Salem or ever practiced witchcraft on the land cannot be verified.
We were never able to physically connect the Ketchums who were burned at the stake in Salem, Massachusetts. But it's very interesting that there's a Ketchum Street or a Ketchum Place right in the immediate vicinity of the residence.
In the summer of 1965, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue is sold to the DeFeos, a close-knit Italian Catholic family. It is a prosperous time for the city-bred DeFeos, a prosperity evidenced by their move from a small Brooklyn apartment to the 6-bedroom, 2.5-story Dutch colonial on Long Island's affluent South Shore. The DeFeos have 5 children: John Matthew, Mark, Allison, Dawn, and their eldest son, Ronald Jr., better known as Ronnie or Butch.
Ronnie had a close relationship with his mother. His relationship with his father was a love-hate relationship.
Mr. DeFeo's way of showing love to his children, especially his eldest son Ronnie, is by spoiling them with money and material things.
It would be nothing for his father to give him, $1,000